Hello, and welcome to another conversation on leading in crisis, part of an ongoing initiative from Government Technology and the Center for Digital Government. In this series of interviews, we've been taking a look at some of the leading innovations in state and local government in response to the coronavirus pandemic. I'm Zach Patton, the chief editor for the content studio here at Government Technology. And as I said so far in this series, we've highlighted some specific initiatives that local governments have put in place in response to the pandemic. Today, though, we want to look forward and turn our attention to the months and years that lie ahead. So we're talking with someone who has a real national perspective on all of this, Celeste O'Day. Celeste is a business development director for the public sector at Oracle, which has helped make this series of interviews possible. Celeste works with agencies, departments, and governments across the US and Canada to identify, operationalize, and implement integrated technology strategies. Celeste, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Zach. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. States and localities are really at this important inflection point right now. They're pivoting from their initial response to the pandemic crisis and really starting to look ahead to the longer term challenges and implications in the months and years to come. Just from your perspective, how have the events of 2020 really reframed the issues for states and localities?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can all agree 2020 has been a unique year, right?
To say the least.
And it's not yet over. So who knows what's still yet to come, right, in the last few months. So governments have always been challenged, right? They've always been challenged to deliver services to their constituents and their customers, if you will. And the coronavirus, the pandemic specifically, really highlighted their need to be more nimble in the whole conversation, right? So I think the challenges they faced have been maybe amplified or magnified. And then when you layer in on top of the pandemic, we've had a fair number of natural disasters, right? Between fires in California, hurricanes down in the South that, kind of wreak havoc. So there's been a compilation of things that have just kind of perfect stormed together, I would say, this year for them. And so what I think they're finding is that the ability to be nimble is the new paradigm for them, right? So they've always been really good at understanding what their constituents need, what their customers need, and trying to find innovative ways to deliver it at, with constrained budgets, right? So I think as we go forward, the budget constraints are going to continue, right? I don't think that's going to be a shift at all. So that's something they're familiar with, maybe a little bit tighter than they've had in the recent past. But I think this really, again, nimbleness, that's kind of the new paradigm. I think that public sector at large, whether we're talking about government agencies, whether we're talking about municipalities and localities, or whether we're talking about edu, right? But be it higher education or K-12 education, right? Secondary education. So I think the ability to be nimble, to react quickly to the challenges that they're faced with is going to be critical to their kind of ability to deliver those services that they need to deliver.
Yeah, that ability to be nimble and to react quickly is not necessarily something that has been a hallmark of state and local government. Are there specific examples that come to your mind as really, success stories or good models for us to take a look at?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, this series has kind of highlighted several of those, right? So I'll just call out a few that I think are really kind of good indicators of the ability to be nimble. And when I say nimble, I think it's also about the ability to kind of think smaller in some level, right? How can I do something that's a little bit more bite-sized, if you will, that can add discernible value quickly and either give me a time horizon to the bigger nut that I'm trying to get to, right? But at the same time, solving an immediate pain point that I have, right? So, there's a lot of pressures and pains that these folks are faced with, but when you have to react nimbly, you can't always do the big thing, right? So we got a couple great, kind of stories that we've heard out there throughout this, challenging time that they've been faced with. And one is down in the state of Oklahoma, right? So, one of the biggest things that's happened, I think, for public sector at large is this work from home concept, right? It's not kind of natural business operations for them, right? Typically speaking, they're brick and mortar in your four walls, you know, delivering the services to the people that you serve, whether it's constituents, whether it's student, what have you. And so when they had to shift to be wholly or fully remote, they didn't necessarily have the infrastructure, the human infrastructure and the technological infrastructure in place to support that as effectively as maybe they could have. And so in Oklahoma, one of the things that they discovered quickly was when everybody was working from home, the number of call center inquiries spiked, right? IT support spiked. And their ability to react to those was challenged, you know, understandably challenged. So they were able to, in 8 days, so somewhat that right there alone, you say they deployed something in 8 days is somewhat mind-blowing, right? When you talk about public sector and being nimble, and this is a hallmark of being nimble here, right? So in 8 days, they deployed a chatbot that lets them help to triage those IT help desks. So their calls tripled during this challenging time, and they were able to react and respond very quickly, and again, deploy a solution in 8 days. That's kind of miraculous at some level, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And then they complemented that. So that's dealing with the IT calls, right? And the kind of the work from home challenge. At the same time, they're also dealing with funding challenges, right? And there's the CARES Act, right? Funding to help support, you know, the execution of business during this challenging time. But you have to, there's a lot of administrivia, I will argue, that goes along with that, right? Being able to track hours, being able to track purchases that are directly correlated to COVID. And they similarly built a mobile app that will enable them to track those hours and track those purchases that are related to their COVID efforts. So again, 2 bite-sized, I would argue, things that they were able to deploy really quickly that had a material impact on their operations.
Yeah, I love that, you know, thinking smaller to kind of attack the challenge that we can, you know, it's such a really interesting shift in thinking. It sort of reminds me of that saying, you know, the perfect is the enemy of the good. It's sort of like the large scale can be the enemy of fixing the problems today, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, the problems are, you know, there's symptoms and there's problems, right? And, you know, oftentimes we need to treat a symptom in order to be able to treat the bigger problem, right? So, you know, spiked call center desks, that's kind of a symptom of, you know, the bigger issue, which is having the kind of construct in place to facilitate a work from home kind of mentality, right? But also, you know, so that was kind of an internal facing thing for Oklahoma, but we also have down in Jackson, Mississippi, something that's a little bit more external facing, right? You know, people during this time need to be able to still pay their bills, right? They got to pay their utility bills, they got to pay their, you know, water bills, what have you. And, you know, you want to also protect the people who serve, right? The people who work for those municipalities. And so what they came up with was kiosks to facilitate bill payments from their citizens, right? So it's a touchless response, right? So they don't have to put necessarily the public sector workforce frontline with, you know, the general populace who may or may not be symptomatic, right? And kind of help them kind of deploy that mentality. So that's something that Jackson is currently working on to help kind of build an operation that enables them to kind of do that, right? Provide those services. And having the infrastructure to support that is kind of what's critical and key to them. So that's how they get it done, right? So again, we can take little stories that are kind of internal focused, bite-sized chunks, but also things that are externally focused that can certainly help not just the internal workings of the staff, but also the way services are delivered to constituents in a way that they like to consume too, right? I mean, we all like to get our services the way we all like the fast food mentality, right, of services, right? Our online shopping mentality, our drive through the drive-through mentality to pick up our coffee or our lunch or what have you. So the ability to have government operate in that same kind of commercial way is definitely desirable, right? And the ability to do that.
I think is so interesting because a lot of these things, especially when you talk about those citizen-facing service delivery mechanisms like kiosks or those chatbots or whatever,
right.
Those are things that, a year ago, I think a lot of governments would have thought, well, that's a nice thing to have. That would be kind of cool. Some people are talking about wanting that. And we've seen that shift so quickly from this like nice to have to an absolutely integral part of citizen service delivery. And I just think that's such an interesting, I don't know if we want to say it's a silver lining of 2020, but it's an interesting thing to watch.
Yeah, and I think it's important, right? Public sector oftentimes I would say gets a bad rap, right? They're heavy, they're process heavy, they're bureaucratic. There's that general thought process out there that that's how government functions. Government doesn't really want to function that way, right? They're kind of constrained by their own processes, and I think the beauty, the silver lining, if you will, of kind of this perfect storm of issues that the country's faced with is it has kind of made them think outside the box, right? Yeah. And it's made them be a little bit more relaxed, if you will, in being so constrained by the processes that they have always kind of held on to, if you will, for whatever. Yeah. So I think that's another silver lining, right? It's kind of forced them in a way to challenge. I'll say, how about that? They challenge the norm of how they execute, and I think that's great.
Absolutely, and we could do a whole other conversation about procurement regulations, but one thing that's come up in a lot of those conversations is we were ready to have these conversations. We were excited to do these collaborations. We just needed to have some of the procurement stuff get out of the way or get streamlined, but that's a topic for another.
It is, absolutely is.
but a part of that is I think a shift in how public sector organizations are thinking about their private sector partner relationships. And can you talk a bit about how that has changed over 2020 and how you see that kind of going forward?
Yeah, and I think, the PPP, the public-private partnerships, are kind of a critical execution point for public sector to really kind of act more commercially, if you will, right? And deliver services and capabilities more commercially, if you will. And there's a lot of great kind of groundswell evidentiary information about that out there, right? Of what's happening kind of with these PPPs, if you will. There's obviously the things that are tied to the pandemic that we're seeing, right? Whether it's the national testing platforms that are out there to kind of help, track and manage and monitor what's happening with infection rates, with vaccine trials, et cetera. So I think, the PPP, it's ultimately a win-win, right? I mean, it's a win for the commercial enterprises like Oracle, right? Who want to be able to help our customers, do great things and deliver great services and add value to what they're doing. And it's great for the public sector because they get the benefit, if you will, of kind of that commercial mentality, those more, in some cases, sophisticated tooling and technologies that are available that might not otherwise have been available to them or they didn't think could be available to them. So I think there's a lot of really great, that's a big opportunity for them, right? It's kind of a way, not only for them to be able to be more forward thinking and forward executing, but also a way for them to build these relationships that will help them kind of drive the future of public sector, right? And that's not just done with technology partners, it's also done with, system integrator partners, right? Out there at large too, right? The Accentures of the world, the Astutes of the world, et cetera, right? So, there's a lot of great thought going on out there. And when all the great minds kind of get together, fantastic things can happen.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I want to go back to, because you mentioned kind of the revenue piece of this a couple of times, and I think it's interesting because we talk a lot about in this series we've talked about preparing for the next crisis.
Yeah.
And we tend to talk about that in a little bit of an abstract way, but I think that the truth is we kind of know what the next crisis is, and it's here, and that is this sort of drastic revenue crisis, this budget shortfalls and budget constraints. What does that look like to you for states and localities for the next X number of years?
Yeah, again, I hate to use the new normal, right? But there's a whole lot of new normals going on out there right now, and a lot, and budget challenges are just one of the many, right, that they're going to be faced with. But I think the revenue shortfalls that they're going to be dealing with, and the fact that these are public service agencies who have critical services that they have to deliver, right? By hook or by crook, they have to do it. They have to deliver these services. These are necessary services for the populace at large. So having a constrained budget means you have to be a little bit more nimble, again, to reuse that word, in thinking about creative ways to deliver those services cost effectively, right? But also process effectively as well, right? And I think that, public sector always tends to lag, I would say, a little bit in the adoption of newer technologies or newer capabilities or newer ways of kind of doing business, if you will, right? For various reasons, right? There's not one reason why that's the case. But they're often a little bit slower to kind of uptake, the latest flavor, if you will, of what's happening out there technologically. And I think that budget constraints are really going to continue to drive them to looking at the newer technologies, the cloud-based technologies, right? The more operation expense focused technologies versus capital expenditure technologies, right? So that it's a way for them to not have to do these major significant outlays like they're used to, right? It's more of a payment plan style, right? It's like leasing your car concept, right? I can always get the latest model, right? I can always get the greatest bells and whistles, if you will, by kind of going on that process and having to only pay, operationally expenditures, right? Versus capital expenditures. So I think that's going to certainly affect the way the budget shortfalls and this ability to deliver services in a cloud model for an as a service model, I think is a great convergence ultimately of those two, circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. I was talking with a public sector person, I think just yesterday, and I sort of put the question to him of, well, this, you must just have all these budget constraints are sort of keeping you from moving to the cloud. And he said, actually, it's the budget constraints that are sort of pushing us to move to the cloud. And
Exactly.
There's a real energy around that, and some funds from the federal government as well for that, right?
To help, absolutely. I mean, there's certainly money out there to help, and I think it's kind of, again, it's interesting because it sometimes it takes the wake up call, if you will, in whatever form it takes, whether it's in our personal lives or our professional lives, for us to think, well, okay, well, maybe I need to shift my mindset a little bit, right? And maybe I need to think a little bit differently about how I've thought about things in the past. And maybe this cloud thing isn't so bad, right?
Yeah.
And I think the reality too is they can get a lot of, again, the newer capabilities, but in a secure platform. I think security is probably one of the biggest inhibitors for why the adoption has been slower, I would argue, in public sector, right? And understandably so, right? We're talking about social security numbers, we're talking about, address information, about tax records, what have you, right? So this is privacy concerned data, so I get it, right? But then you got to kind of shift your thinking a little bit and go, okay, but who better to secure my information than companies that's what they do for a living, right? That's their kind of DNA, that's in their DNA, right? And it's not necessarily in government's DNA, right? So.
Well, and the other thing, when you talk about shifting to that subscription model for the services, it's, the solutions are constantly being updated, right?
Correct.
It's just such a departure from the way governments have done things, every 10 years building a new system or whatever.
Absolutely. And that's the beauty, right? Again, I kind of correlated it to the leased car, right? I got the newest model this year. Next year, I'm going to trade it in and get next year's newest model, right? And I'm going to get all the good stuff that goes with it. Cloud kind of gives you that same ability to constantly be evolving, right? And constantly taking advantage of, the latest and greatest technologies, whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's machine learning, right? So yeah, I mean, there's great stuff to be had. And I think, this unfortunate circumstance and times that we find ourselves in, there's always a silver lining to everything, right? And I think that, one of these is government's ability to kind of think a little bit more out of the box and be a little bit more nimble in their execution. And I think that's good.
Well, Celeste, we have just a minute or two left, and I have a sneaking suspicion about what your answer is going to be, but sort of a single kind of takeaway or something that you think governments need to be thinking about as they're, thinking about ways to best prepare for 2021 and beyond?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think smaller, which sounds strange, right, in some ways, but think smaller. Think about, kind of ways you can treat the symptoms, as I commented before, right, which can help, cure the disease, if you will, longer term. So think small. Try to be a little bit more nimble in how you kind of focus your energies and your activities. Kind of got to break things down, I think, into something that you can consume quickly and easily. And those are quick wins for government. When government can show their ability to deliver, effective services quickly, in an easy consumed format for their constituents, whether it's a locality, whether it's a utility authority, whether it's a public hospital, whether it's a educational institution, right, who also, by the way, is feeling a lot of pain right now, and huge paradigm shifts for them as well. Think about how you can do that in consumable chunks that you can execute quickly. I think that's going to be key for them to kind of be as effective as they can be. They're not going away, right?
Yep.
Public sector government is not going away. It's not like a commercial enterprise who may or may not shutter their doors, right? Public sector can't shutter, you can't shutter your doors, right? You have to provide those constituent services that are so critical to their well-being. So let us help you, right? Use those PPPs, right? Use those public-private partnerships. Use the CARES money or the federal funding dollars that are out there for you, and think about how you can use that in a nimble, right, and consumable way. I think that's key.
That's great. Those are great thoughts. You said one thing that just reminded me of a question I really want to, a more specific question I want to touch on before I let you go, which is about educational institutions, both K-12, but also higher ed.
Yep.
Those are among kind of the most disrupted aspects of government that we've seen this fall. Can you think about what do you think about kind of how education is responding to this and what some of those longer term shifts might look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing several things, right, in education. So I think both higher ed and, K-12 education are both faced with the need to, just like everybody else in the world, deliver their services remotely, right? So being able to deliver those services remotely, whether it's through Zoom video conferencing or some other video conferencing technology out there, being able to reach out to their student population, reach out to their administrators, and kind of get the dialogue going. I think it's a challenging time for those folks, right? And so, if we think about, I have a specific example for you in higher education, right? So Loyola, right, University in Chicago, there's a lot of need to see your advisor, right? You're in higher education, students need to see their advisors. Doesn't always coincide with their schedules, right? We got class schedules, they've got availability, they don't always sync up. And some of the stuff, again, maybe I can get answered in another way, right? Without having to sit in front of my advisor out there. So kind of helping to improve the student experience. And again, we're talking about higher education students who by and large are the younger generation, right? Not everybody, but by and large, they are the digital natives, right? This is kind of, they've never not known a world without a cell phone, right?
Right.
Without internet, right? They've never, that's just, without the web, that's just not, they're digital natives. So being able to kind of deliver the services in a way that they want to consume, right? Know your audience, I guess, if you will, right? If you're performing, know your audience. So being able to deliver kind of data and information to them in a way that they want to consume it, whether, again, chatbots, right? I mean, and that can even apply to the younger kids too. Little kids are super tech savvy. I mean, toddlers are on tablets, right? So the ability to interact with a device is again, it's in their DNA, right? So having services that you deliver in that way can be monumental in improving the student experience, right? And improving the advisor experience. So, in getting questions answered without having to kind of take up the time unnecessarily with maybe some more routine types of questions. Again, chatbots, they're a key out here, I would argue, in the success of being nimble and responding to your students' needs. So again, there's a lot of things like that are happening out there, and being able to respond 24/7, right? Again, those higher ed kids, they're up all hours of the night, they're up all hours of the night, right? The faculty advisors may not be, right? But if I can get my question answered 24/7 through a chatbot, or at least get me pointed in the right direction, that's a win, right? That's a win for the university. And it doesn't require human capital, which we all know is probably the most expensive revenue line, budget line that anybody has.
Totally. And it goes back to some of the innovations that you were talking about earlier, where what's going to be really interesting is to see, because those offer greater convenience and greater responsiveness, I guess, for the users and the people on the other side as well, it's going to be really interesting to see what of that gets sort of made permanent beyond the current situation. So. Yeah,
again, let's not treat some of these new things we've done as Band-Aids, right? That we ultimately rip off and toss aside, right? I think these have some staying power, right? These ways of delivering services and thinking about how we interact, even just with the people that we serve. These should be growing roots right now, I hope, within the policy.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Well, listen, Celeste O'Day, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your insights with us today. And I just want to take a moment to thank Oracle for, again, making this entire Leading in Crisis series possible. Thanks so much, and we'll see you again soon.